So thank you so much for joining us for this conversation. I think as a journalist, this conversation really interests me because the moment I got on the phone and started talking to our panelists to decide what we wanted to share with you today, they said, let's talk about the challenges, which is exactly, as a journalist, your editor is going to be like, but how is this actually going to work? So that's what we'll talk about today, is how do we go from the lab to the market. My name is Lesley McClurg. I'm a science reporter at KQED. We are the NPR affiliate here in San Francisco, and I focus on health and medicine. And last year found out about clean meat at a panel and pitched the idea, and my editor said, yeah, but is this some dream idea that's never going to come true? And it's pretty exciting where we've come, just like being here this year compared to last year. So let's get started. Why don't each of you introduce yourself, just briefly tell us who you are and maybe why you care about this industry.
Hello, everyone. My name is Lavanya Anandan, and I'm with Merck KGaA Darmstadt, Germany, which is a global life science, healthcare, and advanced materials company. In the US and Canada, we're known as Millipore Sigma. So this business makes a lot of research tools and technology platforms, as well as services for the biopharma industry. So we've helped scale the biopharma industry over the last 30 years and have a lot of know-how in that area. Myself, I'm a molecular biologist by training, and I have a lot of experience in the life science industry, primarily within the sales and marketing world, as well as strategy and innovation. And I'm representing today a group called Strategy and Transformation, which is tasked with generating the next generation of businesses for our company beyond its current scope. And we believe that clean meat or cultivated meat, we can apply a lot of our existing expertise and capabilities in order to develop novel solutions to help scale and really reach the promise of this industry. And this includes things like media development and bioreactor design and process development, but also looking at areas like analytical assays for safety. So that's why we are interested on this panel today. Thank you for having us.
Yeah, my name is Kris Chatrathi. I'm with Black & Veatch. We're a global engineering and construction firm. My background is primarily bioprocess engineering, everything from biopharmaceuticals to biochemicals to food ingredients. And Lesley, you asked, why am I interested in this? And for me, the long-term goal of feeding another billion people or another 5 billion people is a challenge. I think if we don't take on now, it'll be too late. So that's what interests me about this.
I'm Kelvin. I'm from A*STAR. A*STAR stands for the Agency for Science, Technology, and Research. We are part of the Singapore government, and we recently realized that importing 90% of our food from overseas is not a sustainable way for us to address our food security. So we recently announced a 144 million Singapore dollar investment into public research to address this. And part of it is going to consider if cultured meat is a viable option for the country to rely on as a means to locally produce meat for our people.
My name is Vincent. I'm with DuPont DuPont Nutrition and Biosciences, formerly DuPont Industrial Biosciences. My role is to lead a global team responsible for regulatory science and advocacy, focused on food safety and biotech safety. My background is actually in agricultural engineering and animal nutrition. So I have roots in traditional agriculture, and have been involved in both agricultural biotechnology and industrial biotechnology for over 20 years. My interest, of course, in this overall topic is this is, on the one hand, a opportunity for my company to get involved and partner with the emerging cell-based industry and its supplying supporters. We feel there is more than likely a need for supporting technologies, right, for this industry to be successful. And on the second part there, my personal interest is in safety and regulatory, and I'm very interested to help support, establish meaningful, yet not onerous frameworks to evaluate the safety for regulatory approvals.
We're getting some encouragement to speak louder, so let's all project into the audience. Can we just go down the line? So we've been here for a few days. What is one challenge, one roadblock that we must get over that's most pressing on your mind? Lavanya, can you start?
Yeah, so I think the biggest challenge right now is that there's no defined process yet for scaling cell-based meat. And of course, the industry is in the very early stages, and this is still a work in progress. And this is, I'm talking about everything from what kind of cell type do you want to work with, what cell line do you want to work with, and then developing a media that is both sustainable and economically viable, as well as looking at bioprocessing technology. So there's so many different aspects that we all need to actually work together on if we're going to reach commercialization in the time frame that we all talk about, right? And this requires all the various different stakeholders to come together on one table. This is the leading academic institutions that we heard from this morning. These are the startups, these are the corporations, and companies like us that are sitting on the table all have to come together and acknowledge that this is a very difficult problem and a complex problem, and there's a lot to be discovered in this process, and we can all work together to make that happen. So I think agreement on process, I would say, is the biggest challenge that we need to address.
What about you, Kris?
Yeah, I would concur with that. Maybe add a little bit more definition to it. I think we're still in the lab scale, and we're still trying to decide whether we're doing suspension cell culture or tissue cell culture on some kind of platform. But in either case, the bioreactors that we would need haven't been fully thought through at the large volumes that we're going to have to produce this cell-based meat on.
Yes, and I fully agree. I think the one big thing that bothers me is how do we match the minimum viable product to the available technologies currently, and also matching them in the future. What does this mean? What new technologies we need to make this more possible? And I think that currently, whether you are talking about a minced meat type of product or making a tissue engineered construct, you will need cells as the raw material, as the building block. And then if you're unable to bring down the cost of cells and treat them like transistors, it'll be very difficult for us to build something that's cost effective and price friendly for our consumers.
All right, so building on that, cost is of course still a constraint, and growth factors are one factor, not the only factor that defines at this time the high cost. So industry needs to come together with a supporting cast of established pharmaceutical and fermentation players to work on defining which growth factors are really essential on a minimal media basis, and then to work on producing these at a much larger scale than today to bring the cost down. A second constraint really is the regulatory, and it relates back again to a process definition, at least at a high level, and a definition of what the inputs are and how they're used, such that regulators can actually wrap their brains around how to look at this. Otherwise, we're going to be dealing with very much a case-by-case assessment rather than an assessment that is going to benefit the entire industry.
So from my perspective, one who's not steeped in the industry, it sounds like we're at very early stages then in terms of actually getting to scale. And we throw around in the media and we hear from, especially from like CEOs, et cetera, that we're 2 to 3 years out. I'd love to hear how out being that I would be able to go to the store and buy one of these products or order one in a restaurant. Given what you just said with these challenges, what kind of timelines do you foresee that I would be able to actually get one of these products?
So,
cell-cultured meat products.
So I'll answer that, and I think it's going to be a longer time frame than that for you to buy a cell-cultured meat at Whole Foods or wherever else. Just to put an example, if you wanted to buy 100 grams of protein, or just to give 100 grams of protein for a metropolitan area, we would need to somebody consumes 100 grams per day, we're talking about 36 million kilograms that would have to be produced in order to get it into the stores. And my rough calculation is that we're looking at hundreds of thousands of liters, probably a 1 million liter type of facility. And that could be like 50,000 liter bioreactors or 200,000 liter bioreactors. But no one that I know of is working at that scale right now. So we have to think in terms of scaling up from, say, I'm going to say optimistically, 100 liters and 1,000 liters to hundreds of thousands of liters, unless we have some fairly impressive breakthroughs in the type of bioreactors and that we'll need.
What do you think then is a realistic timeline?
On the optimistic timeline, if we use other technology timelines, say like, for example, solar panels, I think a decade is probably more realistic. Decade to 2 decades probably is more realistic in terms of trying to get the prices down and the technology and the volumes up.
Right. Anyone else have sort of a projection timeline that they'd like to throw out there?
Well, I can't speak really for any of the individual companies, right, and not knowing exactly where they are in their development process either, or their exact route to market in terms of going to restaurant chains first and then grocery. So in terms of technical capabilities at a small scale, some of the startups are close to being ready or will be ready in a year or two. That doesn't necessarily mean you'll find it on the supermarket shelves. Obviously, there's the regulatory process as well. And I would expect that initially, the first several submissions, let's say in the US, would take a few years to get through the process. So my prediction would be grocery shelves, not for another 4 to 5 years. And that's optimistic.
Okay.
I think I'm a little bit more optimistic in terms of the timeline. I think a lot of the companies talk about going in high-end restaurants first, right? And these are going to be very small quantities for a pretty high price, so premium-priced products. And I think that's the thing that we have to think about when we're developing solutions, is that we have to think about performance first, right? So there are all these complicated milestones that we have to reach, and it's not going to happen cheaply. Right? So we have to think about performance and reaching all these milestones given the tools that we have today, and that could reach the premium product, but it's not going to reach, again, like the grocery stores. Right? So I think we have to be cognizant that this is a scientific problem. It's going to require expensive solutions in the early days, but we have to first show the proof of concept, get it into people's hand, have them accept eating such products, and then we can worry about cost next.
What do you think are some of the misconceptions or the education that needs to happen in terms of regulating and getting regulation streamlined forward? Because that could be a large and time-consuming roadblock along the way.
Right, and you're asking me, right?
I am asking
Okay.
you. You keep saying regulatory, so I'm...
Sure. Well, again, what we do need is a consensus process definition at a high enough level where most startups could sort of fit as an umbrella, right? Where most startups could fit their process underneath. I think an exhaustive analysis of all of the inputs being used, as well as from an overall biology perspective, what issues may arise. We're starting to see some of these things being suggested, and I'm not the one suggesting them, but they're out there, such as concerns around the emergence of prions, tumorigenesis, if you're trying to push cells to divide and grow as fast as possible. These are the types of things that need to be looked at, studied, in an effort to essentially debunk them and put them to rest, such that they don't become part of the considerations by regulators to be included in a routine evaluation process, because that would be the worst case scenario. So early on, address any issues that anybody might bring up, including critical NGOs, address them collectively as an industry, and then move forward.
This morning I thought it was interesting on one of the panels, they suggested that Asia might be the market that is quickest to bring these products to market. Kelvin, I'm curious if you think that is the case, and what are the benefits if that is the case, and what are the potential pitfalls if that is the case?
Yeah, I didn't comment anything on the timeline as the government, representing the government, but I would say that we do have a mandate to increase our local production of protein, for example, and other food products from less than 10% to 30% by 2030. There's not a lot of time for us to develop new things and bring out to market, and hence I was really concerned about how you match the minimum viable product to the currently available technologies, and at the same time grow new technologies along the way. So we hope to see, some company and our regulator to be able to bring this to Singapore within the next 10 years. In Asia, Asia has a rising middle class, and increasing demand for protein may not necessarily be matched by our ability to supply the protein. So we're not talking about replacing meat with cell-based meat or plant-based meat. We're talking about how do I provide more options to the consumer so that they can make decisions on their own conscientiously, and then therefore enable us to breed new technologies that make sense for us. So in Singapore, we're a small country. We want low land use technologies with high productivity. Cultured meat currently, within my estimations, if you look at cultured chicken and GFI's estimates, we can produce twice the amount of chicken meat per land area per year, right, compared to conventional farming. If you're talking about chickens, you can pack more chickens in the same area. But if you talk about cows and pigs, we can do more with the same technology, which is cell-based meat. So this gives us a reason to invest public money and taxpayers' money into developing, enabling this for consumers. But when it comes to regulations, I also want to mention there's a difference between actual risk that the scientists can measure, and there's also versus perceived risk by the consumer. So some of these studies, I agree that we should do it one-off and try to convince consumers that these are not of a huge concern. But we also, when it comes to regulation and safety, we need to think about what the actual risks and hazards are, and that might or might not take some time to develop because you need expertise from all over the place. It's not just biotech, the food space, right? And they don't usually speak the same language, regulatory speaking. So then we got to bring them together.
Does anyone foresee pitfalls if, for example, it sounds like Singapore would be an ideal place for this to launch. Is there a pitfall for starting in Asia? Anyone?
Well, I think the price point is something that we have to kind of look at. Singapore is probably unique, but if we look at, so if I were to compare Norway to India, for example.
For manufacturing, like where you would make the product?
Well, yes, but more like if I wanted to deliver 50 grams of protein in Norway, Norway probably would accept a price of $2, but the same 50 grams of protein in India would probably go for 50 cents. So I think there's a wide range of prices that people are willing to pay at even just not the premium protein I'm talking about, but just generic protein. Mm-hmm. So I think in order to get to the Asian market effectively, we would have to be very aggressive about decreasing the cost of cell-based meat production.
And my assumption is that they would have to get it right, per se. So if it doesn't go well, for example, in Singapore or in Asia, Japan, these countries that are showing higher interest to cultured meat products, if it doesn't go well, say culturally acceptance, marketing, et cetera, these would also be potential pitfalls. Am I right there?
Yeah, I was going to add that I think price is really important, but if you're going to charge a premium price, then you have to give some benefit, right? So is it going to be a healthier product? Are you going to market it as a more sustainable product? So what is the additional benefit that the consumer is getting? And if you think about sustainability, which is, I think, a really great point to make with cell-based meat, I think we still cannot say with full confidence that the cell-based meat process is going to be more sustainable than conventional meat. And I think the jury is still out on that. Again, going back to the point that we don't have a fully flushed out process yet for cell-based meat. And once we do have that process established, then we could confidently say, what is the water usage, what is the energy usage, what is the waste management, et cetera. So I think that clean meat narrative has to be much more stronger if we're going to charge a premium price and ensure that the consumer is getting something for what they're paying.
Right. What about, Vince, can you talk about the nutrition claims? So you mentioned sustainability, which is kind of the big sell, obviously. But what about nutritionally? Are we making too big of promises that we may or may not be able to come through on?
Well, in the cell-based meat space, I don't think outrageous claims are being made today. After all, the purpose or the objective is to make meat, wholesome, nutritious meat, just like whole animal meat. And so at least the initial target is not to differentiate it or make it more healthful. There may be a lower risk of disease or contamination that is possible, but not so much on the overall healthfulness. Sustainability, I think there is a great potential for this industry to deliver products that are more sustainable. The exact picture still has to become clear because indeed not all of the inputs and of course the energy and water usage for those inputs have been established. But at a high level and certainly conceptually, if you bypass the animal and feed cells directly, you do have a really good chance of improving overall sustainability, knowing that a chicken's calorie conversion is 2-to-1, a pig's calorie conversion is about 4-to-1, maybe 5-to-1, and a beef, cow's, cattle calorie conversion and protein conversion in general is about 9-to-10-to-1.
So I'd like to add on to that.
Please.
I think for me, price matters a lot. I mean, I'm not saying, because the price will determine the portion of the market that they're going to access first. So I would classify cell-based meat or culture meat as a disruptive innovation. And new products in a disruptive innovation, in a disruptive technology, typically comes with a premium. And then it will take time for it to become something cheaper and cheaper over time. So even if you look at, so in the University of Bath, there's a researcher called, a PhD candidate called Christopher Bryant, and he recently, this year, published a paper on consumer perceptions in US, China, and India, the top 3 populous countries in the world, and he surveyed about 1,000 consumers per country. And there are very different sentiments, but it seems that in India and in China, consumers are more willing to try these new products compared to in the US. So I guess, well, but the type of consumers you could access to understand cell-based meat tend to be a certain social economic status that, we are not talking about India in general, we're talking about a certain population. So I think that kind of study will be more representing of the initial people who would try and afford and can afford a cultured meat. And for me, that is very important for us to understand. And maybe for this population, they may not think about sustainability. They may not think about nutrition. They may not think about the safety part of it. They might think more about its novelty. I'm not saying every Singaporean is a crazy rich Asian, but I'm sure that a lot of my friends would try it.
I want to support him. All of my friends from India, when I tell them I work on cell cultured meat, they get very excited. And I think it's more of an animal welfare kind of take to that. I don't think we really think in terms of sustainability in the same metrics that we talk about, like land use or water use. But I think the idea that you're not harming animals is really a benefit, a feature, if you will, for this product.
That's fascinating. Yeah, anyways. So obviously to make this happen, you mentioned right from the get-go that we're gonna have to collaborate. I would love to hear, since you've all been in different industries in the past, can you give us some examples, some stories, some tangible, where collaboration was actually what pushed a product forward, success stories I would love to hear, sort of illustrating why we're all gonna need to come to the table. Can you start?
So maybe an example from the biopharma industry, which puts out life-saving therapeutics every single day and makes sure that they're cost efficient as well as safe and efficient. I think that's a really hard problem. In about 2017 or so, there was an organization that was created, which we were a founding member of. It's called the National Institute of Innovation in Biopharma Manufacturing, or NIMBLE is the name of the organization. And what they do is they try to bring all the parties together on one table. And here again, academic institutions, startups, large pharma companies, as well as companies that are scientific solution provider companies like us, and they sit together and discuss what the problems are. They workshop, they share best practices, and then they come up with roadmaps, right? What do we need to do to get to success? If you think about novel therapies like cell and gene therapy, they all have very similar issues that the cell-based meat industry has, and has successfully solved many and are solving many of them today. And they're doing it at a very rapid pace because of this collaboration effort, right? So there are about, I think, 30 plus institutions and companies represented in this one organization that is helping drive novel therapies forward, and such collaborations is what we need in this industry. So I think collaboration is sometimes a scary word, right? Because it means that you have to share, but I think that's what needs to happen next if we're ever going to make this commercially viable and successful.
Do you see a particular silo that's going to need to cross over that doesn't usually cross over to make this possible?
I think every group has its own problems. So large companies like us often think twice before investing in really, really early stage concepts like this. Because we don't know when commercialization is going to happen, when is our return on investment going to come, so that's the question. I think for the startups, it's more around how much can we share without giving out too much information to the competition, right? Academia, the problem is funding, right? Right now there are no not much public funding is available. I think institutions like the GFI and New Harvest are doing a great job funding, but still more funding is required if the academic labs are going to put their time into this instead of, say, regenerative medicine. So I think every group has currently a pain point that needs to be overcome, and I think the solutions are there. It just needs some more money, some more motivation.
Mm-hmm. And I will add to that. I mean, A-Star, where I work, we don't report to a Ministry of Science. It's not just in Singapore. We don't report to the Ministry of Education. We report to the Ministry of Trade and Industry. So A-Star's mission is to develop technologies for or with companies or industry to support local growth in Singapore. So sometimes when you come up with a new technology like this, there's no ecosystem. There is no ecosystem. You got to build it. So then right now we have like 20 plus startups globally for cultured meat, and then the B2B companies like Merck are starting to come in. Then that would probably, globally speaking, fill up that value chain, right? And ecosystem and stuff like that. We don't have any farms in Singapore. It's too small. So then we gotta also have to collaborate with people who can provide cell lines in order to build up this ecosystem in Singapore. I would give an example how A-Star does it. In Singapore, we recently, about a couple of years ago, we started this Advanced Remanufacturing Technology Center, ARTC. And by now, it has grown to more than 70 consortium members in that. And they focus on different aspects that require remanufacturing, whether it's additive, whether it's whatsoever, right? So you have your MNCs coming in and you have a small and medium enterprises coming in, they get to talk to each other and share their knowledge, and they get to also share their equipment, whether it's a beta version or a full version that requires a new version. So then once you put these people together, you no longer have to hire your own team to solve a very complex problem, because you get to leverage expertise in both public and private sectors, right? Then this is where we encourage and appeal to all scientists here that we focus on society and not identity when it comes to solving a complex problem. And such kind of consortiums, that hopefully we can do it for Culture Meet, for example, moving forward, puts the consumer at the center. And I think it will be really, really useful to form something like this.
Other examples of collaboration?
Yeah. Oh, go for it. So I guess I want to bring up the example of ISPE, the Society of Pharmaceutical Engineers. And they've done a pretty good job of, so if you look at the pharmaceutical industry, there's oral solid dosage as well as injectables. And the sterility levels that you need for biopharmaceuticals that are injected are different than, say, for oral solid dosage. But they've been able to bring all of these different manufacturing processes together to provide kind of a global standard that people can follow. And I think in the cell-based meat area, I think we're going to have to come up with those same kind of global, I'm going to call them manufacturing standards, but it could apply to hardware as well as processes, just even definitions of like what is sterility or what is the required sterility. That's something we're going to have to agree on, both from like media sterility as well as equipment sterility. So that would be an example of collaboration that's worked well over the last 20, 30 years that would be useful for this industry.
Yeah, and building on that, I can give you the example of a segment of the industrial biotechnology industry, that being the enzyme industry, where we've come together in various trade associations around the world to reflect on, indeed, a common description of industrial processes to make enzymes, whether that's submerged fermentation or solid state, and to really define standardized parameters, to then define a common safety evaluation methodology that actually forms the basis for regulators to look at this in a holistic way, a consistent way, even, right, across different companies. So I'm personally involved in the Enzyme Technical Association. I'm chair of that group. And in the last several years, we've put out a number of publications that actually form the basis now for a number of different regulatory bodies to approve microbially produced enzymes, with the heavy doses of biotechnology input as well.
And that's very true. I mean, if you're here by now, you would know that there's Singapore all over the place in this conference. So we brought, the Singapore food story that I just talked about, the 30 by 30 goal, it engages all the different public agencies to make this happen. And the biggest one that we brought in together is the regulator, so that we get innovation and regulation going hand in hand. And as a scientist, I love it when I give me more constraints, right? When I give me more constraints, then my design, my research is more directional, and I have less conditions to try, and I get to the solution much faster. And regulations provide these constraints not as a research problem as well, but it also comes with a societal control, right? You get to think about the entire thing just because we are regulators helping us early in the innovation.
And then added to that, regulators need to continue to be informed and educated on the evolving technology, because technology is not standard. We might agree on a high-level process, but it keeps, in the end, it keeps shifting. Again, an example from the enzyme industry was the advent of biotechnology, right? So we could go well beyond just isolating organisms that happen to produce enzymes, like from environments that were conducive to this. But we moved into initially cloning genes from one organism into another. Nowadays, we're using synthetic DNA to do so. We can flexibly protein engineer the enzymes to tailor them to the conditions, the application conditions, whether those are extreme pH, temperature, et cetera. We're deploying techniques like CRISPR as well. The safety methods, right, under supporting the ever-evolving technology also need to be updated and need to be socialized, right, to the regulators, not only in the US, but globally.
Lavanya, since he just mentioned CRISPR, how will genetic technology, genetic engineering, how can it be used in this industry? How do you foresee those places coming together and moving forward?
Yeah, so I think genetic engineering is a bad word, right? Many people don't want to talk about it, but the promise that the technology holds is immense. And that's been demonstrated in the biopharma industry. We now have clinical trials that are utilizing CRISPR technology to treat diseases that previously could not be treated. But let's think about how can that be applied to cell-based meat. Now there's a lot of problems with scale and cost, and gene engineering could solve a lot of these problems. So you can actually engineer the cells to grow faster. You can engineer them to differentiate better. You can adapt them to suspension cells, which means they can grow in these large steel tank bioreactors. You can make sure that they're really sturdy so they don't fall under the shear stress that we talked about. And also you can potentially engineer more nutritional flavor and health benefits using gene engineering. So I think a lot of the problems that we talked about could be addressed through the technology. Of course, the initial products should be unmodified so that the consumer acceptance is more robust, right? But once we cross that stage, I think the technology holds a lot of promise to solve many problems under cost and scale umbrella, and it should be seriously considered. And we should, of course, be very transparent about what this technology is and what it can do, so that we don't fall into the same trap that we did in the past, right? So I think it's up to us here on the panel, up to the companies to be extremely transparent if they are introducing gene-modified products, how they use the technology, what are the benefits, and really help the consumer understand the concept before it goes to market.
Kelvin, can you then enlighten me? So in America, we're talking then about a genetically engineered meat product grown in a lab. That's going to be a tougher sell, but would that novelty sell well
in Asia?
In Asia, could that be?
I just moved back to Singapore last year. I learned that not GM foods in Singapore have to be labeled GM. As a scientist, I eat everything. I know that I trust my digestive system, and I trust my immune system, and then they should all become simple nutrients for my body to use. But I can't say that for my friends who are not scientists, right? They are still worried. But I also want to challenge, I tend to challenge them and think about, how much of the safety data do you know about the meat you eat every day? But when I take a piece of meat and I serve it on a dinner plate, nobody complains. I take that same piece of meat, I put it on a petri dish, then somebody feels weird. And nothing has been added. Right. There's no genetic engineering, but you just feel weird by virtue of swapping that dish, Right. So I don't think that a lot of our sentiments towards science and the use of high-tech tools, right, is rationally motivated. And then sometimes we're going to provide data to support that. Sometimes it's just read your textbook.
And it's a matter of it's a matter of familiarity as well, right? And I'm from a business that does a lot of B2B transactions, so we haven't had to deal a lot with consumer perception. But think of it this way: without genetic engineering, we'd be harvesting rennet from the stomachs of calves, right, to make our cheese. So it'd be killing calves, literally, to make cheese. And today, right, we are expressing a gene encoding for chymosin, which is the active ingredient in rennet, right, in yeast and bacteria to do the same thing. And genetic engineering has enabled that. So this is the type of story we need to share much more, right, with consumers. And once they hear this, they will not shy away from eating cheese.
I'm going to toss a question from the audience. Thank you for sending your audience. This one's to Lavanya. Do you envision a standardized protocol for commercialized cell ag? Are biotech companies actively involved in this process right now?
I do envision that we will have a protocol this way, but I don't think anything is in place right now to deliver on that. I think 2 days ago there was a technical summit that happened, right, with the GFI was leading, and the whole idea behind that was to get all the players in one location and start talking about the concept of collaborating and eventually developing a standardized process. So I think everybody knows this is needed, and all the parties are here, even in this room, and we just need to do more of the sharing and collaborating and being more open about what people are working on behind the scenes at the startups and at the companies.
So be chatting at lunch. Talk to your neighbors. This one I think is pretty fascinating. I'm not sure if any of you can answer this, but will flavor companies play a role going forward?
Yes. I don't know how pure muscle cells taste like. I don't know if I probably know how fat cells taste like. You just cut the piece of meat from a steak and you eat it. Do I have if I have pure muscle cells without blood, how would that taste like? I know without fat, it will be very lean. So beyond flavor, there's also texture. So I think maybe for the initial cell-based meat products, you will have to think about we need some flavor supplementation. Until we are able to do more, even nutritionally, maybe you need some supplementation too. But at least we can control it. Unlike in farming, cell-based meat allows us complete control over what happens in the dish and in the tank. But farming, you have to leave it to nature a little bit. Yeah.
Absolutely. There's probably not a single ingredient type that won't be considered for inclusion in cell-based meat. Particularly if your product is going to be more ingredient-like rather than a whole cut, right, a whole muscle, then definitely a number of different ingredients as well as enzymes will be considered, right, for inclusion.
Mm-hmm. This is fascinating. Does it hurt an animal to take the starter cells, to get the starter cells? Where do they come from? And would that hurt an animal?
Well, it depends. It really depends. If I need this piece of tissue from a cow versus this piece from a shrimp, it's going to be very different, right? So it depends on it's very case dependent. And are you talking about growing fat cells or growing muscle cells or growing a cell that's responsible for the flavor of meat, but you don't need a lot of? Right? I think this is where a lot of biological studies can go into to figure out what is the causal cell type that you really need.
What about a muscle cell for a steak? So let's talk about like the cell that's going to be used someday maybe to grow a cultured
I think
T-bone.
This seems like a silly answer, but it's less hurtful than the way we're doing it now.
Good answer.
But I think.
So there is some pain?
Well, no, I think there's been some companies that have demonstrated that they can take the required cells and that the animal still lives and runs around in the pasture.
Fair.
I think that's been shown. So is it zero harm? Probably not. But I would say it's not debilitating in any way.
Right.
That would be my answer.
And generally the cows aren't running around after they're taken to slaughter these days, so yes.
And I think there's a really nice movie that just made which shows them taking the cells from the feather of a chicken and isolating the cells.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So there are many different ways of doing it, right? Depending on the cell type that you will finally isolate. So yeah, plucking a feather, probably not so.
Probably not.
Well.
Got it. We've got 30 seconds left. I'll toss this one to Vince because I think you can answer it. Why would prions, et cetera, be an issue for cell-cultured meat products?
I don't think they are an issue for cell-cultured meat products, but If you force cells to double as rapidly as possible, then there is a bit of an unknown, potentially, right, of how these cells may evolve, whether or not you might induce tumorigenesis, and so it is an issue that just needs to be studied and put to rest.
Awesome. Thank you all for joining us, especially right before lunch. Enjoy your meals.